This is our fifth lecture on critical thinking, and this one is going to focus on errors in reasoning based on relevance, or fallacies of relevance. So let's take a look at this claim. Does this sound like a reasonable claim? We believe that by the government educating women and making it easier for them to find jobs in both the economic and social fields, we have partly helped them on the road to liberation. We have also set up children's nurseries to enable mothers to go to work because many husbands insist that a woman's duty begins at home. We believe these programs help us progress. So, to give you a little background, this was said by somebody in a country that has a strong history of misogyny and the belief that women should be staying at home with the kids and not at work. So, do you think that somebody saying that, hey, we should give women, education and therefore jobs and help them, watch children that way they're not forced to stay at home? Do you think that sounds like a reasonable claim? I mean, I do. The only problem is that this guy said it. Saddam Hussein, a notorious mass murderer and dictator, the ruler of Iraq that was overthrown. Um, However, the fact that this terrible person said it does not change the fact that it is a reasonable argument. His character is not relevant to the statement's truth. So relevance is focusing on what is actually important for whether or not something is true or not. If something is relevant, it provides evidence either for or against the truth of a claim. For instance, the question, is President Obama a good president? A duck in China is irrelevant, the color of his suits aren't relevant, but his ability to pass legislation and interact with other leaders is relevant. As at the time that I'm recording this, we're right in the middle of the presidential debates between Clinton and Trump, and obviously we see lots of instances where relevant personal attacks are being brought up. You might argue that their character is relevant if we're going to elect them into office, which is a fair claim to make. However, all sorts of irrelevant things are being brought out of the woodwork that aren't necessarily relevant to their ability as a political leader. And so focusing on the different fallacies of relevance is going to help us identify the multitude in ways in which people try to lead us astray. So a fallacy is an error in reasoning. All of the information you have might be true, but you haven't used the information in a logical way. So, for instance, Saddam Hussein was an insane killer. Saddam Hussein thought the government should provide childcare to help women work. Therefore, childcare is evil. Doesn't quite follow. Right? So a fallacy of relevance is when you are bringing in irrelevant information, evidence that is not important to this discussion. So sometimes bad people have good ideas. Bad sources have correct outcomes. Hypocrites are still right. The majority is wrong, and experts in one area are wrong about other areas. All right, so these are the different fallacies of relevance that you're going to learn, and you're going to learn several other fallacies in the next few lectures. And the important thing to know is not necessarily what their names are. I mean, you're going to need to know their names for the test, but a lot of these names you can forget the minute the test is over. There's a couple that I'm going to identify that are well-known ones that you should know by name, but by and large, it's not important that you can provide a label for it. The important part is that you're able to identify and explain in your own words what makes it irrelevant, not necessarily give it the right label. All right, so the ad hominem fallacy. This is actually one that you do need to know by name because it is prolific, and when people often say, "Hey, that's an ad hominem," they're referring to this fallacy. So this is one that you should know by name. Well, that refers to attacking the character of the person making an argument instead of attacking the argument itself. So this basically it's saying that the speaker is bad, so their argument must be too. We just experienced an ad hominem fallacy. Saddam Hussein's views on women can't be right because he oppressed political freedom and killed his enemies. I mean, perhaps we should be suspicious of Saddam Hussein, his very low ethos, but just because he's a bad guy does not mean that his ideas are all necessarily bad. The tu quoque fallacy is Latin for "and you're another." It's also called an appeal to practice. This attacks the practices of the speaker, and by practices I mean just what they do. You're accusing him or her of being a hypocrite. So, for instance, Michael told me to stop smoking, He smokes all the time. So notice how this is a more refined and specific way of attacking the speaker of an argument. The ad hominem is a more blanket, they're bad, so their ideas are bad. The two quoque is saying, no, they are directly contradicting their argument by their behavior. So it's a more specific kind of criticism. So, just to clarify the distinction, ad hominem accuses someone of being a bad person generally and attacks their character, whereas the tu quoque accuses someone of being guilty of hypocrisy and therefore making their argument incorrect. Sometimes hypocrites are right. All right, let's look at a few cases and see if you can come up with what it is. You may want to pause the video. You can't get driving directions from Hitler. The man killed millions of people. As an ad hominem fallacy. I mean, in 1930s Berlin, I bet Hitler would be very helpful with driving directions. I can't believe that guy told me that alcohol, I can't believe that drunk guy told me that alcohol is a terrible drug. Tu quoque. Because he drinks, he actually might be more informed about how terrible alcohol is. All right. The genetic fallacy. When you consider the source of an idea as relevant to the value of the idea itself. Kind of similar to the ad hominem fallacy, but rather it's a more general sort of where it comes from is bad, therefore it must be bad. Examples of this might be Mad Child isn't a good rapper, he's from Canada. The new Apple computer is amazing. I know this because Steve Jobs designed it. Volkswagens are evil because they were first made by Nazis. The first two examples are feeling pretty old at this point. But yeah, the idea is that they come from something bad, therefore they are bad. So what do the two quoque, genetic, and ad hominem fallacies all have in common? They all find that the source, which includes people, of an idea are relevant. They all believe that a bad or good place of origin has an effect on the idea itself. And so the important thing to take away from this is that a good idea is a good idea because it's a good idea, no matter where it came from. Right? The bandwagon fallacy, also known as ad populum, assumes the truth of a conclusion because the idea is popular. It's the everybody's doing it fallacy. And so here we've got lemmings, and they sort of are all following each other off a cliff. An example of this fallacy would be One Direction is one of the best-selling bands of all time, therefore one of the best bands of all time. The next fallacy is the false authority fallacy. This fallacy treats someone who has no relevant authority in the field we are discussing as trustworthy. So an example of this would be, according to my financial advisor, the ethical problems raised by investing in oil aren't my problem. Obviously, your financial advisor doesn't have relevant expertise in the ethical dilemmas of oil. You shouldn't listen to your teacher about health advice when you have the flu, or your plumber about how to write a good thesis statement. So what do the bandwagon appeal fallacies and the false authority fallacies both have in common? They're both based on poor use of ethos. They both trust in people when you shouldn't. So in the first lecture, we talked about use of ethos and how it can be used to persuade people, but can also sometimes lead us astray. And most of these fallacies are trying to take the most logos-like appeal, or logos-like method to come up with the right answer. So a lot of fallacies are sort of suspicious of pathos and ethos. All right. The straw man fallacy is another one that you should be familiar with. It's a very common way of describing this fallacy, but it is also sometimes called the paper tiger fallacy. And that is when you are misrepresenting your opponent's argument to make it easier to argue against. And this is a very important fallacy to be aware of because it is very common, particularly in politics. It's also a very difficult fallacy for a lot of people to understand. And the basic idea is this. You are pretending to argue against the real idea, but you're not. You're arguing against an easier version of it. And the place of origin of the straw man verbiage is that you might imagine that a knight, rather than proving his mettle by attacking a real knight and beating a real knight, instead fills a bunch of armor with straw and then goes and beats up that straw man to prove how tough he is. That's essentially the straw man fallacy. You're, defeating an easier version. And the paper tiger is sort of the same idea. You're not beating a real tiger, it's just an origami placeholder. So an example of that might be anyone who isn't a Democrat has to explain why he or she doesn't like equality. And that's not a fair thing to say. Anyone who isn't a Democrat isn't necessarily a hater of equality. Okay. A lot of times these fallacies are easier to see when you see a back and forth between two people. One person makes an argument and then someone else argues against an easier version of that argument. All right. A faulty analogy. This occurs when you make an unfair comparison. That is, the similarities just aren't relevant. For example, Bob says, it's important to be proud of your cultural heritage, and then Joe says, that's what white supremacists say. And Joe has a point. I mean, white supremacists are proud of their cultural heritage. However, the relevant similarities really aren't there. The thing that makes white supremacists bad is not that they're proud of their cultural heritage. It's all of the hating of other cultures that they do and their violent behaviors that make them bad. It's not the pride that is their problem. All right. So what do the straw man and faulty analogies fallacies have in common? Think about it for a second. They both argue against alternate claims where there aren't enough relevant similarities. All right, so they're sort of dodging the issue a bit. Alternate. All right. Speaking of dodging the issue, ignoring the question. So ignoring the question changes the subject to focus on a new topic entirely. You get one question, but you just totally ignore it and try and change it to another one and act as if you're responding to it. So for example, we don't have to worry about saving pandas because homelessness is a much bigger problem. What? That doesn't really tell us anything about like why pandas aren't worth being saved and why they're mutually exclusive. I mean, just like it's totally random. This fallacy is pretty easy to identify. Just anytime you just feel like, whoa, where did that come from? It's ignoring the question. The red herring fallacy. This is when you bring up any irrelevant fact. All of these fallacies, all of the relevance fallacies, are red herring fallacies in some way. We'll call something a red herring when we don't have a more specific name for it, like ad hominem. So, if you are on the test and you see a fallacy and it is an ad hominem fallacy, and there's like the red herring, which is an option, and there's the ad hominem, which is an option. Always go for the sort of more specific one. Red herring is a sort of more blanket general term for any kind of irrelevant fallacy. And sometimes there's going to be an argument where what they bring up is just totally irrelevant, and we haven't come up with a specific fallacy for it yet, and that's why we have the sort of the blanket generic red herring fallacy name. For instance, President Obama needs to pass better gun laws. I mean, he barely passed a decent healthcare bill. So they're trying to use sort of his difficulty in passing healthcare as sort of a reason for why he should be passing better gun laws, or sort of to add on to the criticism of him and his poor gun law passing abilities. And it just kind of seems irrelevant. It's like it's a red herring. It's not relevant to why he needs to pass better gun laws. Okay, so notice how ignoring the question just sort of changes it entirely, and the red herring fallacy is staying on topic but just bringing irrelevant issues into that topic, so to speak. They're often confused. Here's an easy way to separate them. Red herring accuses one of using a piece of information that is important, whereas ignoring the question is like telling someone that they've just changed the subject entirely. It's like kind of yelling like, hey, focus, at someone. All right, so these were the fallacies of relevance. On to the next lecture.